Christmas is a strange time these days, isn't it? I find that it's starting to ring increasingly hollow, feeling like a surreal performative affectation of joy and comfort amidst degrading institutions, atomised communities, debased traditions, and Doctor Who not having been good since 2017. In the wake of this literal, cultural, moral, and spiritual bankruptcy, it's increasingly hard to shake the feeling that the holiday as a whole has been reduced to solipsistic consumerism as a cope for the meaning of Christmas gradually evaporating. After all, the child was born, and yet the promise of peace on earth still hasn't paid any dividends after 2,000 years. Or so I thought. For right when I was about to give up on making sense of Christmas as we experience it today, something captured my imagination. 100 or so years ago, in one of the darkest and bloodiest moments in the history of man, a miracle happened. The Christmas Truce. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Today's sponsor is me, because we don't have many sponsors this month because the economy is in the toilet. Thank you, Biden. But anyway, this is where I take the opportunity to just shout out my own stuff because I definitely don't do that enough. So if any of you want to go over and subscribe to my second channel, where I usually do about 2 uploads a day, usually talking about news and politics and mostly free speech centered subjects. And also, if all of you want to subscribe to the Patreon, because there's actual perks on there now. I'm sure you've seen by now, you get your name listed at the end of the video. Also, we have some chat rooms and stuff like that where I give some insider information on upcoming videos, and there's just all kinds of perks now. So, if you want to go on to the Patreon or the Subscribe Star where you get the exact same perks, that would be smashing, that would be wonderful. So, if you could all go and subscribe to the second channel, if you could all go and tell your friends about this channel, because YouTube does not share me in the algorithm at all. And also, if you could just sign up to the Patreon, sign up to the Subscribe Star, get yourself some nice little perks, get your name listed at the end of videos so that you can be rendered permanently unemployable forever and probably monitored by MI5, that would be lovely, that would be fantastic, and it helps me continue to do this work that I love so much, and I think some of you love so much. Most of you. Some of you. But anyway, go do those things. I'll love you forever. I'll give you a great big kiss on your forehead, and I hope you and your family have a very Merry Christmas. In the summer of 1914, a Serb did Balkan things and made it the entire world's problem. Treaties dominoed on treaties until all of the great powers piled in for a good old-fashioned scrap. In the nationalist fervour that ensued, young men signed up in droves to grab a piece of the glory of honourable service to king and country. You surely know what happened next. The brutality of industrialised warfare blindsided everyone as men were shredded en masse by artillery and machine guns. Old-fashioned manoeuvres ground to a halt, and the war ran to a stalemate, as the initial excitement of the race to the sea died down after the First Battle of Ypres. Despite the Germans having expected to have the whole show wrapped up in just 6 weeks, and the mantra over here being home by Christmas, both sides proceeded to literally dig in for the long haul, scarring the landscape with lines of trenches and quickly reducing the space between those trenches into a cratered, barren wasteland that was tangled with barbed wire, also known as no man's land. Despite a lull in the intensity of the fighting as reinforcements, munitions and supplies made their way to the front, there was still plenty of savagery to go around. In the first 4 months of the Great War, 306,000 Frenchmen, 241,000 Germans, 30,000 Belgians, who cares, and 30,000 Britons were slaughtered, with disproportionate losses among the officer class resulting in a mass extinction event for the old aristocracies. And it only got worse as the autumn gave way to winter. Weeks of heavy rain set in, followed by frost and snow. Where the men weren't fighting each other, they were struck down by trench foot, frostbite and disease in their very own waterlogged trenches. If they actually made it back. Many drowned in shell craters because the walls were too wet and muddy for them to climb out. The men on the front were cold, wet, muddy, scared and miserable. Stuck taking potshots at each other while waiting for the inevitable. The mangled corpses of their friends lying right in front of them. According to the author, Michael Jurgs, you couldn't bury the dead because if you tried, they'd shoot you. So you always had to look on the no man's land and you can see your own future, which is to lay dead there. Naturally, there were calls to end this madness, with the newly elected Pope Benedict XV being the most notable proponent for a ceasefire at Christmas. So, the quote, "The guns may fall silent at least upon the night the angels sang." He had hoped that a break in hostilities would lead to more lasting peace negotiations and a potential to end the war. But such a notion was officially and unanimously rejected. As Christmas approached, cheer was very, very hard to find. Many actually called for the holiday to be cancelled entirely. As a German hussar officer fresh off the back of Ypres, Captain Rudolf Binding wrote on the 20th of December, "If I had my way, some person in authority would proclaim that Christmas will not be celebrated this year. I cannot attain to the lack of imagination necessary to celebrate Christmas in the face of the enemy. The simplicity of Christmas with the laughter of children, surprises, the joy of giving little things, this is as it should be when it appears alone. But when it enters the lists with a war, it is out of place. Enemy, death, and a Christmas tree. They cannot live so close together." But not everyone was so quick to say humbug. In fact, many, such as a volunteer named Karl Aldag, thought that Christmas would be more important than ever, when he said, "It is a strange kind of Christmas this year, so really contrary to the gospel of love, and yet it will be more productive of love than any other. Love for one's own people and love to God. I honestly believe that this year the feast will make a deeper impression than ever and therefore will bring a blessing to many, in spite of the war." And in the end, jollier heads prevailed, and a great effort was made by every country party to the war to spread at least a little Christmas cheer among the soldiers. Vinters provided thousands of bottles of wine for the French troops because, of fucking course. The Tommies were also sent more than 355,000 brass tins that were embossed with a profile of Princess Mary. And these tins contained tobacco, chocolate, and a message from the King and Queen that read, "May God protect you and bring you safely home." And the Germans were also sent Christmas trees by the Kaiser, who also gave gifts of pipes to the rank and file and cigarettes to the officers. Charities and the soldiers' loved ones also came out in force to provide other gifts, cards, and home comforts to the men, such as clothes, games, plum puddings, and much, much more. Many were sent to nurses for passing out among the wounded men in the hospitals. Something of a Christmas dinner was provided to the men lucky enough to have the day off in the billets. But unfortunately, the men out on the front lines were stuck with their usual rations, which was usually corned beef known as bully, a hard biscuit, and maybe a nice little tin of gristly and fatty beef, and possibly some vegetable stew. However, the best present of all had already been enjoyed by the men for a while. A break. You see, no man's land was barely 100 feet wide at its narrower points. So, when the fighting was a little bit less intense, a tacit arrangement began to develop between the British and the Germans, where low-ranking officers would order their men not to fire unless fired upon. Obviously, this was unauthorised and carried out at the officer's own discretion, but this live and let live attitude is very well documented all throughout the opening months of the war. And both sides spent these lulls in the fighting shouting insults at each other. However, curiosity and boredom took hold, and it's very difficult not to find a degree of sympathy with the enemy when you're close enough to hear them talking and also to smell their cooking. So hearts began to soften over Christmas. The reports of fraternisation came in as early as the 11th of December, when the men began to talk to each other. Saxon troops carried the dialogue because there were not many Britons who spoke German, and there was a real emphasis placed on the Germans opposite the British being Saxons, because the fraternisation was justified by the fact that the German brass, the real enemy, were Prussians. The Germans even emphasised this as they called out to the British, essentially pleading for no more brother wars while attempting to relate to the men across from them, saying things like, "We're Saxons, you're Anglo-Saxons, what is there for us to fight about?" Of course, the men had been forewarned against this behaviour by the brass, with Brigadier General G.T. Forestier Walker issuing the following order, and I quote, "For it discourages initiative in commanders and destroys offensive spirit in all ranks. Friendly intercourse with the enemy, unofficial armistices, and exchange of tobacco and other comforts, however tempting and occasionally amusing they may be, are absolutely prohibited." Nevertheless, the Germans' question appeared to ring true, because on Christmas Eve, the artillery fell silent. And then the Germans started to sing. After a rendition of Silent Night, the British sang back, and then, amazingly, both sides sang together. According to Graham Williams of the 5th London Rifle Brigade, and I quote, "First the Germans would sing one of their carols, then we would sing one of ours. Until, when we started up, 'O Come All Ye Faithful,' the Germans immediately joined in, singing the same hymn to the Latin words Adeste Fideles. I thought, well, this is really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war." Of course, not everyone was on board with such merriment. One Tommy responded to a request to join in with, "We'd rather die than sing German." Nevertheless, the atmosphere became increasingly relaxed. Men, unafraid of snipers, lit fires and lights in both trenches and sat up on the parapets. And the odd scouts actually crossed paths peaceably while on patrol, though sentries still stayed wary just in case anyone tried something funny, and no one really slept that night. According to Major J.Q. Enrique of the London Regiment, "I think everyone felt very homesick on Christmas Eve. Thoughts of our families at home were uppermost in our minds. The night passed without a shot being fired on either side. Our sentries were, however, extra vigilant, and I felt quite uneasy at the strange silence. By Christmas morning, a fog so heavy that the men could barely see their own hands had descended, prompting them to use the cover to repair and shore up their own trenches and also to bury their dead, not helped by the fact that the muddy ground had frozen solid. Suddenly, the fog cleared, and there the Germans were, out in the open, doing the exact same thing. The German soldiers called out to the British, "Good morning, Englishmen, a Merry Christmas. You no shoot, we no shoot," offering a day's truce as their comrades climbed up and out of their trenches, unarmed and waving their arms or white flags so that they didn't get shot. Then, slowly, tentatively, the British also emerged to join the Germans in the middle of no man's land. Though, naturally, there was still an abundance of caution on both sides. But the ground was ripe for a day's peace. The ground was solid, the sky was clear, and it was lightly snowing. It was a beautiful a day as could be in such a setting. And with hostilities suspended, the burials continued, and the British and German soldiers conducted joint services. Second Lieutenant Arthur Pelham Byrne recalled that prayers, notably the 23rd Psalm, were, and I quote, read first in English by our padre and then in German by a boy who was studying for the ministry. The Germans formed up on one side, the English on the other, the officers standing in front, every head bared. Once done, there was an unspoken agreement that no men on either side would attempt to enter the other's trenches, though officers would still keep an eye out for each other's sniper and machine gun positions, as well as the general condition of the trenches. Both sides were in a similarly dire state. For the rest of the day, the men continued to sing together, take photographs, and fraternise. Many Germans had actually spent a lot of time in Britain before the war, and they were asking for updates about rather niche places and goings-on. One Tommy even got a haircut from his old German barber who he patronised at home before the war. Other enterprising soldiers were charging cigarettes for haircuts. But goods and services weren't just bartered for, as there was a big exchange of gifts between the trenches, with men trading souvenirs from home, buttons and badges, pickle hobs, tobacco in various forms, and foodstuffs, including a whole roast pig for some very, very lucky soldiers. This story is my fucking favourite though. Out of everything that happened in no man's land that day, this story is my fucking favourite. The Germans traded a barrel of beer from a French brewery that was behind their lines in exchange for plum pudding from the Royal Welch Fusiliers, which was implicitly accepted as an unfair trade because both sides agreed that French beer is fucking terrible. The British and the Germans sat there in no man's land, all laughing and shaking each other's hands over how fucking awful French beer is. And the beer was in fact terrible. It was so bad that just a few days later, the British shelled that brewery. The beer was so bad that the British blew the fucking brewery up. At some point, the most famous aspect of the entire truce literally kicked off when the Tommies and the Fritzies alike pulled out footballs and started playing impromptu games, with goalposts being marked using caps and jackets like we all used to do when we were little boys. They were running around acting like little schoolboys. This was World War One, so some of them were literally schoolboys. But anyway, these football games were mostly unstructured kickabouts, as the men all had a nice run around to try and keep warm. Though there was one recorded instance of a game being played properly with a British chaplain serving as the referee. And the Germans won this game 3-2. But allegedly, the Fritz who scored the winning goal was offside. But considering where everyone was, the shouts of offside being the extent of that day's conflict is rather remarkable, and you know what, thank you, we'll take that. Overall, the men got along surprisingly well. So much so that the day's peace brought out a wide range of interesting feelings, both about each other and also the war that had brought them together that fateful day. The Christmas Truce actually exposed a wide gulf between the impressions that the men had of their enemies and of reality. Even before the fraternisation started, curiosity about what the other side was really like was rife in the wake of a vicious propaganda war. Lord Kitchener's wasn't the only finger being pointed on the posters. Both sides spent a lot of paper accusing each other of heinous things such as war crimes, and practically inciting a sort of blood feud between both sides. Germans saw the British as unscrupulous mercenaries who would do anything to maintain their dominance over the world's trade, while the British saw Germans as barbaric, warlike Huns. Because that's what happens during a war. A lot of you haven't realised that yet. That's what happens during a war. Propaganda. You're being propagandised. Right now. All the time. See the Taliban? Remember the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all those terrorists we didn't like? See back when it was Russia invading Afghanistan? They were the brave freedom fighters. They were the brave freedom fighters. But then when we went in there, they became the terrorists and the insurgents. We good, they bad. I love blue team. I hate red team. We are the good guys. CNN, Fox News, and the BBC told me so. It's like, honestly, so many of you think that you're immune to propaganda, and it's fucking adorable. However, the degree of goodwill during the Christmas Truce was so striking that the preconceived notions bred by this campaign were even discussed, openly, honestly, and civilly. According to Captain Sir Edward Hamilton of the Scots Guards, they think that our press is to blame in working up feelings against them by publishing false atrocity reports. I told them of various sweet little cases which I have seen myself, and they told me of English prisoners whom put they have seen with soft-nosed bullets and lead bullets with notches cut in the nose. We had a heated and at the same time good-natured argument and ended by hinting to each other that the other was lying. Despite his scepticism regarding the Germans' accusations, Captain Hamilton believed them when they said that they were tired of the war. Though he still did call them Huns in his diary. Old habits. Despite this hatred having been fostered and stoked between the men on both sides of the war, about 100,000 men across 2/3 of the Western Front took part in some way. And every single one of them was very, very aware that they were part of something historic and very poignant. With no coordination whatsoever, in defiance of explicit orders, truces spontaneously occurred all over the place in almost the same way and all at the same time. Some stopped at a ceasefire, others called out and held up messages, some met to bury their dead, and others met right in the middle of no man's land. But regardless of the extent of these small localised truces, it was a very, very surreal experience for all of the men involved. The story similarly captured the public's imagination. Did the truce prove that if enemy soldiers from different warring nations could all get along, perhaps peace was possible? For some, the surprising degree of friendliness and empathy that the men all had for each other pointed in that direction. As Colonel Scott Shepherd recalled, several of them expressed their dislike for the whole war, in fact. They weren't aggressive at all. Some of them said that they had been to London, been to England. In fact, they gave every indication of being glad to meet us. Furthermore, Murdoch M. Wood of the Gordon Highlanders told Parliament in 1930, "I then came to the conclusion that I have held very firmly ever since, that if we had been left to ourselves, there would never have been another shot fired. It was only the fact that we were being controlled by others that made it necessary for us to start trying to shoot one another again." With that in mind, could the mass laying down of weapons on Christmas Day have culminated in them staying down? Could a mutiny by the rank and file on both sides have forced the powers that be of their respective nations to make peace? A few who looked back decades later actually believed so. Stanley Weintraub, the author of Silent Night, the story of the World War I Christmas Truce, spent the final chapter speculating on what could have happened next. He believed that the war ending that Christmas could have prevented the Russian Revolution and all of the horror that came afterwards. The Treaty of Versailles would never have been imposed on Germany, and she would never have been beaten down to the point where the Third Reich lashed out. And also, Woodrow Wilson would never have been re-elected, sparing the old world from the ruin of American interventionism. Could the men sharing smokes and gifts and singing little songs that fateful day in no man's land have the power to prevent all of this? No. Despite anecdotes and personal opinions here and there is little evidence of Wood's account of wishes for a lasting peace being particularly widespread. All of the men knew that peace hadn't broken out, and this was just a day or two's reprieve, if they even got that. You see, not everyone was feeling particularly Christmassy. Despite being a noted Anglophile, one Corporal Hitler objected as a point of principle when he said such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honour left? This Corporal Hitler guy sounds like a right stick in the mud. I really hope he never got involved in politics or anything like that. And there were plenty of reminders of the true nature of the situation in the background, which didn't quite make it into every trench. One truce even ended prematurely when Private Percy Huggins took a headshot from a sniper, one of several soldiers who were caught off guard in a similar manner. According to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, 79 men died on that peace day. There were even more sections where the fighting just didn't stop at all. In some places, this was mutual. In others, men on one side would start to come out in good faith, and opposing officers gave the order to open fire anyway. To quote one account, "Before we could take any action or do anything, we were ordered to open rapid fire, you see." Which we did. The Germans did not reply to our rapid fire, they simply carried on with their celebrations, ignored us completely, and were having a very fine time indeed. We never did anything else but simply continue in our wet trenches trying to make the most of a bad job. Some officers, however, were less than magnanimous about it, such as Captain Billy Congreve, who said, "They came over towards us singing. So we opened rapid fire on them, which is the only truce they deserve." This man really pulled us. So anyway, I started blasting, but see, to be perfectly honest, right, when you know that there's truces happening all over the place and everybody's getting along, and the Germans come over singing with their hands up and they're trying to be nice, and you gun them down, you're a piece of shit. I'm sorry, you're an absolute piece of shit. That is not British. Especially back then, British officers were supposed to be gentlemen who were honourable in war. Fuck Billy Congreve, that guy's a piece of shit. But anyway, elsewhere, truces were actually proposed by one side and were rejected, with one German lieutenant declining a day's truce with the British out of a sense of blame for the war, saying, "We do not doubt that you are men of honour. Yet every feeling of ours revolts against any friendly intercourse towards the subjects of a nation which for years has, in underhand ways, sought the friendship of all other nations, so that with their help annihilate us. A nation also which, while professing Christianity, is not ashamed to use dum-dum bullets, and whose greatest pleasure would be to see the political disappearance and social eclipse of Germany." Wherever it was observed, the truce was largely exclusive to the British and the Germans. The French and the Belgians, they weren't particularly up for it, given that they were stuck playing host to the bloodiest war in history. And the French were especially sore about the Prussians having taken Alsace and Lorraine. Remember that barrel of French beer that the Germans rolled into the British trench? Well, for having drunk it, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers were heckled and spat at by French women. The extent of any French participation in the Christmas Truce tended to be a brief handshake, a salute, and the exchange of cigars with the Germans, before minding their own business as they buried their dead. On the other hand, some truces lingered into Boxing Day, with shelling resuming right away, but the sniping taking a little bit longer. Some truces even lasted until New Year. But regardless of how long the Christmas spirit lasted in certain trenches, it was merely a temporary reprieve from the gruesome business at hand. Despite the concerns of the brass, the soldiers themselves were under no illusions about what was going to happen next. A German soldier's parting words to a Tommy returning to his trench were, "Today we have peace. Tomorrow you fight for your country, I fight for mine. Good luck." At 8:30 on Boxing Day morning, Captain J.C. Dunn of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and I quote, "fired 3 shots in the air and put up a flag with Merry Christmas on it. And I climbed on the parapet. He put up a sheet with thank you on it, and the German captain appeared on the parapet. We both bowed and saluted and got down into our respective trenches. And he fired 2 shots in the air. And the war was on again. Then they butchered each other. Very many senior officers were very unhappy that the Christmas Truce had happened at all, despite orders to the contrary, with General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien complaining that, and I quote, "I have issued the strictest orders that on no account is intercourse to be allowed between the opposing troops. To finish this war quickly, we must keep up the fighting spirit and do all we can to discourage friendly intercourse." He also lamented the state of morale on the front by saying, "This is only illustrative of the apathetic state we are gradually sinking into." However, despite the massive headache that the truce had caused for the top brass, it was met with a surprising degree of ambivalence. After all, at least the men were repairing and strengthening their trenches. No one was punished or court-martialed for daring to have peace in no man's land, likely because doing so would have been much, much more devastating for morale than just letting the men make friends that they shouldn't have for a day. Still, the brass made sure that this was not repeated. Strict orders to stop fraternisation with the enemy were reiterated with threats of court-martials. There was also orders for officers to shoot any enemy soldiers who were trying to approach. And there was even machine gun bursts being timed to drown out the singing. And this time, the orders were enforced. The following year, Captain Ian Colquhoun of the Scots Guards actually turned down a request for a truce by a German officer, though he did grant a request for 45 minutes to bury some dead as they exchanged cigars. 10 days later, Colquhoun returned to the billet, where he was arrested and charged with conduct to the prejudice of good order and of military discipline for approving of a truce with the enemy. At his court-martial, he was convicted and given a reprimand that didn't affect his career, likely due to some fortunate connections. Colquhoun's lawyer was the Prime Minister Herbert Asquith's son, and Colquhoun's wife's uncle, Asquith himself, was very, very unhappy with the proceedings, having said, "Everyone who knows the facts of the case all say that it was a monstrous thing that the court-martial ever took place." The Christmas Truce never happened again. Little live and let live moments did occur the following Christmas, but any attempts at anything more than that were shut down. But from 1916 onwards, none of these measures were even needed. By this point, everyone on both sides of the front was so embittered and battle-hardened that the propaganda just wasn't needed anymore to stoke the hatred that they had all developed. Why would any man want to fraternise with an enemy who had done this to him? As historian Modris Eksteins put it, it is the last expression of that 19th century world of manners and morals, where the opponent was a gentleman. As the war goes on, the enemy becomes increasingly abstract. You don't exchange courtesies with an abstraction. Therefore, the narrative of the truce wasn't particularly convenient, and it wasn't very well recorded in official reports for obvious reasons, with most of the information on offer being a very telling blankness of entries on Christmas Day. The accounts that we do have were mostly compiled from personal diaries and letters that were sent home. And because the letters weren't being censored yet, word of the truce quickly spread. However, it took a while for the news to sink in, because many at home and in the billets thought that the Christmas truce was actually a myth, especially when the powers that be were very quick to downplay it for the sake of narrative cohesion. After all, it's very hard to fight a heroic and noble war when the enemy is just as human as you. In the new year, newspapers actually ran with the story, though it only really became widely known in Britain, because reports of the truce were heavily censored in German and French newspapers as an act of rebellion, and the men involved kept any participation on their part quiet. Even today, this still occurs. The French filmmaker Christian Carion hadn't even heard about the truce when he was a child, and he couldn't believe it when he was told about it by a historian. And when he sought permission to shoot the film Joyeux Noel about the truce on a military reservation in France, a general refused, because, and I quote, "We cannot be partner with a movie about rebellion." Of course, we in Britain were taught all about the truce when we were in school, with the football games being very heavily romanticised and mythologised to the point where their prevalence in the day's festivities became somewhat overblown. The reports of the football games are the biggest example of the difficulty in verifying the exact minutiae of how the truce exactly played out, because accounts are saturated by hearsay from unreliable narrators writing from billets, or hearing about the truce second-hand. Now, you've all seen that very, very famous photograph depicting a football game that is very often attributed to the Christmas Truce. But I'm going to rain on everyone's parade here. That photograph was actually taken a year later in Greece. And it actually depicts two teams of British soldiers. Now, this is not to say that the football games or any of the other main events of the truce didn't happen, but with a story this ostensibly magical pieced together by so many disparate and often unreliable sources, it was inevitable that public imagination would run wild to the point where the day's events almost played out like saccharine vignettes from a Richard Curtis film. But the football game is such a striking image of camaraderie that it is referenced in the memorials of the truce. And the game was actually played by each side's national teams to commemorate the centenary of the truce. And England won 1-0. Perhaps the best of three will be decided in 21-14. Ultimately, retellings of the Christmas Truce are little more than a nice palate cleanser before studying the sheer horror that followed. In the end, despite the heroics of some mad lads past and future, everyone lost the Great War. It left almost 1 million men across the British Empire dead, 2 million Germans dead, 1.7 million Frenchmen dead, 1.7 million Russians dead, 1.2 million Austro-Hungarians dead, 650,000 Italians dead, 325,000 Turks dead, 335,000 Romanians dead, 116,000 Americans dead. And the list goes on and on and on and on, and all it gave birth to was controlled democracy. It destroyed monarchism, and it caused all of the fucking problems that we are facing today. But that is a story for another time. This video is long enough. The First World War claimed the lives of an estimated 8,528,831 soldiers, and resulted in roughly 37,468,804 casualties from combat alone. For some perspective on the devastation that this war wrought, only 53 of over 10,000 towns and villages in Britain, known as the Thankful Villages, don't have a memorial bearing the names of men from those places who died in the war. And a number of particularly unfortunate ones still have a population that is lower than it was pre-war. And absolutely everything that all of those brave men fought and died for was squandered. The war did not end all wars. In fact, it directly led to worse. The fall of many of the old European monarchies, the rise of the Bolsheviks, the atrocities of the Soviet Union, the economic and moral ruin of Weimar Germany, the brutality and horror of the Third Reich, the bloodshed of the Second World War, the collapse or deliberate dismantling of once great empires, the imposition of American hegemony, all of that bullshit, all for nothing. In the end, the Christmas Truce was not a watershed moment, and it changed nothing in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't even a unique phenomenon in that war, being notable only for its timing and its scale. And yet, we are absolutely captivated by it. I dwell on the Christmas Truce a lot at this time of year. I went into this video struggling to find whatever meaning might be left in Christmas, and aside from the obvious, I believe it's to be found here. The story is strangely, beautifully human, with just the right amount of tragedy to really resonate. And it clearly meant a lot at the time. As soldier turned cartoonist Captain Bruce Bairnsfather said, "Looking back on it all, I wouldn't have missed that unique and weird Christmas day for anything." 100,000 men putting their guns down to sing with their enemies must have been quite a sight. Every single account that I've read has displayed the full spectrum of human emotion as the men involved tried to make sense of the truce in their own way. Each chapter of this video has opened with an excerpt from an exceptionally poignant letter that Captain Reginald John Arms of the 1st Battalion North Staffordshire Regiment wrote to his wife. It evokes feelings of disbelief, confusion, relief, merriment and bitter melancholy that are really brought out in a reading by Peter Capaldi that I make a point of rewatching every year. Captain Arms survived the war and lived until 1948. He lived to return home to his wife and tell the tale of mankind at its worst. Though I might say he also saw it at its best. It's easy to be cynical and ask what difference a single day's reprieve would have made, especially considering the abject horrors to come. Well, the truce might not have changed anything in the grand arc of history, but what difference did it make for the individual men in the trenches? How many of them were due to have their tickets punched that day, but were instead spared, living to see their deliverance on Armistice Day? How many lives were saved because the Reaper stayed at home for Christmas and didn't return to collect? If you're so inclined, it's easy to see the truce as a cosmic act of mercy. Christmas was almost cancelled entirely, but after weeks of treacherously wet weather, the ground froze solid and the clouds parted just in time to allow a moment of celebration and brotherhood in an unjust war. It's almost a little bit too perfect. And while there are plenty of reasons for the truce to have spontaneously developed, it's very hard not to think that something else might have been at play. Questions of faith get harder to answer and hope becomes harder to find every single year. But when push comes to shove, hope, even a fool's hope, is often all we have. It's certainly all the men in the trenches had, and it got them through the war. God knows we all still need it, but it can be found in the unlikeliest places. And we have the example of the truce to remind us that the promises of Christmas can be fulfilled. Peace on earth never exactly came about, but the Great War still ended and Christ still rose. There's always hope. So, at the end of the day, I suppose that the real magic of the Christmas truce lies in the fact that it happened at all. It shows that even in our darkest moments, when we are stumbling through the ruins alone and everything is collapsing around us, precious moments of peace and joy, however brief, are always possible. Perhaps that's what Christmas was about all along. We barely made it through yesterday and the sky will surely rain with artillery tomorrow, but the child was born today. And while the salvation he brings may not be found on earth, new life is always something to celebrate. So this Christmas, rest while you can. Cherish whatever small blessings you have, remember the men who were spared 110 years ago, and most of all, hope. But also, remember to spread that hope in what small ways you can. Whatever sacred thing that Christmas means to you, it is your duty to observe and keep it alive. So, go to church and sing a carol, touch some grass without yellow snow on it, eat a mince pie and drink some Baileys, say some very inappropriate political things at the dinner table, tolerate some turkey, and watch Wallace and Gromit with your loved ones. Merry Christmas.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody should subscribe.